Welcome to the Butter Notes podcast with three guys who have no business listening to music, much less talking about it. All right, welcome back to the Butter Notes podcast. This is your co-host, Jim. I'm here with Jake and Tone, and today we're going to do something new. So we went on Rate Your Music and picked a random year, or rather we had a random number generator pick a year for us. And we're going to talk about the top 5 albums for that year. So today is going to be the year 2000. And we're just going to start counting down here from 5 to 1. What do you say, lads? Anything else we want to say before we get going here?
I just wanted to get the inspiration for this idea was Stephen Wilson and Tim Bonus's podcast, The Album Years, where they pick a year and talk about a bunch of music. But we argue too much to be able to come up with suggestions. So I figured it'd be good to just do it randomly and have Rate Your Music populate all the data for us.
And Rate Your Music is a good way to do it because it's... This is Tone talking. Rate Your Music is a good way to do it because it's a fairly good assessment of what music nerds think is the best shit from a particular year. And I think that for this particular list definitely reflects that.
Yeah, this one spans quite a wide variety, this top 5.
Yeah, there's no...
The top 10 even more so.
There's no overlap in genre really at all. Like, these are 5 entirely distinct albums, genre-wise, which is super exciting.
And that's not true for every year, because if you go in the 80s, you get a lot of thrash metal in the top 5. Like, if we ever do an 80s episode, we're going to be ready to talk about Megadeth, Metallica, and, I mean, Judas Priest. There's just all kinds of metal and stuff. So, yeah, it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool we got to start with this one.
Yeah, in the 80s, yeah, a ton of thrash, ton of post-punk. Like, thrash and post-punk are going to honestly dominate 80s charts. 60s charts are going to...
Kate Bush.
Yeah, art pop, post-punk, and 80s metal. 70s, like a ton of prog, especially early 70s, and a lot of punk for later 70s. But I feel like once you get into the 2000s, which it's kind of cool that 2000 is the year we're starting with, because I feel like music just... I feel like the trend with music, what with the internet and everything, is just more and more eclectic. And I feel like that's the general trend of popular music since, I don't know, mid-20th century. And I feel like that really ramps up once the 21st century hits. So it's cool that we're starting with 2000.
Yeah, I mean, with the advent of the internet, we start to see the divorce of acclaim with album sales. I mean, there's just obviously more exposure for bands that would never sell a record. So if there's any hype online, then bands get to be known widespread that would never have been able to make it in the 70s.
Yeah, and despite that's a positive, despite the... I guess we will probably end up talking more about this, but despite the negatives of the internet on music, I think that's an enormous positive that probably trumps the negatives in the long run.
It's definitely good for the fans.
Oh, for sure.
It's definitely better for fans of music. It's debatable as to whether it's better for the artist.
In some ways it's better, in other ways it's worse. Depends on the kind of artist you are in the music you're making.
Exactly. I tend to think it's still better, but there are people who disagree.
And that's a good segue into The Moon in Antarctica by Modest Mouse, first album we'll talk about, which was the major label debut for Modest Mouse, who were a underground post-hardcore emo indie bands in the 90s, and then when 2000 rolls around, this is their major label debut, and is often cited as like an example of a band transitioning to a major label without sacrificing quality or integrity. A lot of people bring up this album as an example of that. I will make an insanely normie admission and say that Float On was the only Modest Mouse song I'd heard before I deep dived their stuff recently. Which isn't to hate on Float On, because I actually think Float On is like an absolute classic rock song of the 2000s. I
don't know it actually.
Yeah, you do. You definitely do.
It's very likely that I've heard it, but I definitely don't know
it's
it by name.
Commercials and it's everywhere. You've heard it before.
It has a really catchy and really good main riff that you would definitely recognize immediately. But yeah, this album is The Moon in Antarctica it's an album that I cannot say I've penetrated entirely. Like, it's a very long and very, very eclectic release. There's almost nothing commercial about it, honestly. I think Jake described it as lo-fi, and I don't really think it's particularly lo-fi. I, like, do you consider this lo-fi music?
I think some of more of the acoustic parts for sure. You get some of that. I think lo-fi singer-songwriter stuff.
Is it lo-fi though, or is it just the fact that it's a guitar and vocals?
I mean, I can't speak to the production quality of it. I mean, that's really a production term. No, I mean, I agree. I think it's a major label release, and I think it was professionally done. It's not fuzzy or anything like that, but it's just there's not a lot of to me. There's not a lot of low end like the bass. Like, it's kind of, I don't know. It's just kind of like it's kind of all up front, I guess, is the way I just like envision this kind of like indie rock type of stuff to be, I guess.
It's noisy.
I would describe the production on this album as cold and spacey.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, and it's definitely noisy. This isn't like a punk rock record necessarily, but that aesthetic is still definitely here, as it is in most indie rock. And there are a lot of really loud, fuzzy moments for sure. But like, I wouldn't compare this to like the Microphones or anything, like, or other lo-fi indie. I don't really think it's quite like that.
I wouldn't either. I think the production's great on this. I mean, they have, they really experimented with it a lot too. There's tons of sounds on here that I don't know, that just kind of give you a feeling of unease, I think.
Yeah, it's a really, really anxious album.
There are moments that reminded me a lot of some of the kinds of sounds you hear on Loveless. Just the way they manipulate the full track rather than any individual track on the song.
Oh, there's definitely shoegaze on here. There's shoegaze on here. There's post-rock on here. There's indie folk. There's punk. There's like ska, especially on the Tiny Cities Made of Ashes. They're hitting a lot of bases here, but it sounds coherent in my opinion, which I think is one immediate thing about this album that's impressive.
Yeah, I agree.
Just a rejoinder on the lo-fi thing. It's also it's one of these things where we talked about this in the neo-prog episode, where it's like it's not neo-prog, but it's called neo-prog is the genre. So anything released now is neo-prog as much as an 80s band might be neo-prog. And I think Modest Mouse was doing the lo-fi thing, but I don't know, I was just thinking of lo-fi rock as like a genre, even if it doesn't describe the recording quality or something like that.
Like, what would be the characteristics of that genre in your mind?
I can't give you a general like formula for it, but I think of when I think of that is the kind of stuff that's happening on like Neutral Milk Hotel, that sort of thing. Just very like kind of folksy singer-songwriter vibes, I guess, is the thing that comes to mind. There's a particular aesthetic that this kind of music captures, and James and I talked about this. That I don't particularly, how to put it, like I don't particularly care for, or that it doesn't resonate me within a certain way. And part of it is just knowing. So I've known people who really like this album, and just I guess and I'm not railing on these people or anything like that, but there's just a certain kind of aesthetic to it that doesn't resonate with me. To me, there's a kind of, and maybe this is what they're going for, but to me, there's this kind of like naivete on like to this kind of music, but by people who are, I don't know, like kind of like, I don't know, affluent university types or something. That's kind of the best I can describe it. I don't know how to describe it, but there's like an underground quality to this, but to me it's like adjacent. It's adjacent to that, but it's still really kind of popular music. And I don't know, there's kind of, I guess the aesthetic it goes for on this, it just doesn't resonate with me as much, and that's a part of the reason why I tend to not like indie rock stuff as much in general.
I mean, that's fair if it doesn't resonate with you. I don't really think that this is an easy album to pin down emotionally, which is something that I like a lot about it. It's definitely disaffected. There's definitely an angry album. But the emotions are somewhat elusive on it, which in my view, like, sort of makes it more authentic. What's the top descriptor on Rate Your Music? I can't see it.
Philosophical.
I think that's probably a good one. Not that it's like
top 3.
highly intellectual, but like it's very introspective and abstract, and the emotions are not really easy. Again, not easy to immediately describe. So I think I would probably say that that's a good descriptor. I'm sure Jake reaches at that as a descriptor.
I don't know, it's kind of what I mean though. It's like, I don't know. It's not like deeply introspective. It's kind of a. I'm trying to not be mean about that. So I didn't really particularly care for this album very much, and I don't want to rag on the album just for the sake of it. But
you can
there's
rag
something
on it.
kind of like there's something kind of, I think there's something kind of like surface level about the abstractness to it. It's like the kind of person I have in mind, I guess, is like, yeah, a kid of like a really wealthy family who is like mad at his parents are trying to get him to do well in his studies or something. So he's rebelling, but he's like got this. He's doing it in kind of a box or something like that. Like it's, I don't know. It just kind of
when it's this complicated and abstract, then I don't see how it fits into that idea.
I don't know. Maybe it's just adjacent to other music like this but that's just, I don't know. That's just the association I have with it. And
I think it's an association that you. Yeah, I think it's an association that you're bringing into it from the outside. I don't really think
Possibly.
it's there that much. And if you don't like the album, that's fine. If it doesn't resonate with you, that's fine. But I do think that association is something you're bringing in from the outside, which is inevitable to some degree whenever we listen to music or approach art at all. We're going to bring in outside association, so I'm not like decrying that or anything. But I don't really know. I don't see that here. There's plenty of other music that came out in the late 90s, early 2000s that I know exactly what you mean. And we grew up with a lot of that in the zeitgeist, which I think might be why you're bringing it in. But I think that there's a lot more to this than the kind of stuff you're talking about, in my opinion.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I think that's right. But it's I think it's implicit in this, just maybe in the context of like, just like where the I don't know. I mean, as we mentioned before, they were kind of an underground indie act, and I think that's bound up in that kind of. And that's just, I mean, that's the fan base. And I'm not trying to judge the music on the basis of the fan base. That's never a good thing to do. It's just that I'm just thinking about the aesthetic and like what's attractive about the music to a certain group of people or something, and whether that resonates with me or not. I'm not decrying. I mean, I tried to describe as best as I could and as politely as possible what kind of person I'm talking about, and like I don't have any animosity towards those kinds of people. That's just the best I can. Like the best poetry I can come up with. Isn't that what we're doing right now, though?
Aren't we talking about the fan base?
What do you mean?
Well, so it just seems to me like the judgment is ultimately coming down to like some kind of stereotype about people who listen to indie music, to like, you know, like the mid 2000s indie rock stereotype, Pitchfork people, the movie Juno. I don't know, and I think, you know, we talked about this a little bit in the Dance Gavin Dance episodes, like when that stuff, when the early Dance Gavin Dance was contemporary, there was definitely a type of, you know, a sort of stereotype of a person who was interested in that music.
The scene kid, yeah.
The scene kid, exactly. And like, there's so much more going on in that stuff in retrospect than I would have ever given it credit for, having associated it with a certain type of fan. I don't know. I think it's important to try and separate stuff from the people who like it.
And I'm trying to do that as much as possible. So again, if some band had a bunch of fans and they start doing horribly illegal things, or they're those, you know, the fans for some reason gravitate and they do something too. Obviously, it's not the artist's fault, and obviously, it doesn't implicate the music in any way. Like, if I'm listening to it in a solitary way, I can blot out like what the fans are doing or saying, and am able to enjoy the piece of music that I'm listening, or engage with the piece of music for its own sake. What I'm thinking though is more along the lines of, in aesthetics, like the thought is that like you're appealing to like an ideal of some kind, and I think, and of course
when
a
you
lot
say
of it's
you're appealing to, what do you mean?
like,
you mean the artist is appealing to some kind of ideal?
like like an ideal form of life or something like that. Like I don't know. There's like Rage Against the Machine.
No, but it's the artist who's making the appeal. That's what you're saying.
I mean, maybe explicitly, maybe not. I'm just saying that, like, I mean, it's like you know, in movies or in like you know, National Geographic documentaries or something, Discovery Channel whatever, and they're like showing a panning of space or something, and you hear that like really ambient, like, you know, electronic music or something, and we've learned to associate that with space, but in some way, I mean, that music is what we think, because that music is itself spacey, so that comparison is readily available or something like that. And I guess what I'm thinking is that there's this kind of, I don't know, it just appeals to a kind of like quality of some kind, and those qualities can apply to people or not. But I'm not thinking about any actual fans or like, you know, no Modest Mouse fan is wrong to me, and I'm just like reacting to that or something. You know what I mean? Like it's not like that. It's just, yeah, there's just like a quality or a something about it, and it's totally fine to describe that in anthropomorphic terms without, you know, implicating the music itself. But there is an aesthetic about it. I don't know. We even talk about the emotions of the music, and very literally, of course, a piece of music isn't emotional. I mean, the singer might be, but like a note isn't emotional or, you know, in itself. And so we bring an association into it, and we learn to associate those things. And I don't think it's completely arbitrary, but it's also, there's some of it's cultural and so on and so forth. So I worry, not worry. I think about the reasons that a particular group of people might be attracted to this sort of thing. Whether they're good people or bad people or not doesn't really matter. But there's just like an element of fashion in this, and I think that's implicit in a lot of art and art criticism and art circles and things like that. And I think the music can capture that quality. I don't know. There's just kind of like there's a reason for it or to it or something like that. That's what I'm thinking. If that helps.
So like any person is going to bring like a huge amount of context and associations into any art that they approach. It's inevitable. I think the fact that, so circling back to maybe how we started this, like this is the year 2000. This is like, we're getting into where the three of us, we're all in our late 20s in 2022. We're at the point in the year 2000 where like we can kind of remember the culture of this time, of the early 2000s. Like this was our late childhood, early adolescence. So the cultural associations that we get are things that we remember from our actual lives. And that association, I think Jake is kind of bringing into the album, which is fine because that's inevitable. But you hear that, like, if we would have grown up in the early 90s, if we were Gen Xers, then it's possible that, like, when we listened to grunge, we would, like, associate that with, like, grunge flannel-wearing kids who we knew in high school. And that would alter our perception. We were infants during that time, so we don't have that association. I talked to my dad, and my dad doesn't really like the Doors because there was like a group of kids in high school in the late 70s in Staten Island who were really into the Doors, and they were like the kind of kids my dad didn't care for. So he brings that association to the Doors, and that shit's old, and he's an older guy. So these associations are very subjective. They depend on where you grew up, who you grew up with, the culture that you have experience with. And so I think that's the set of associations that Jake might be bringing into this album, which is, again, fine. But in my opinion, that's kind of where you're coming from.
I agree with you in part, but there's something a little bit more that I'm trying to say, and it's something like, this is such a weird group to bring in at this juncture, but I was just thinking this is like like the best example I can come up with a band like Amon Amarth, right? Like they're going for like Middle Ages Scandinavian Vikings raiding and plundering or something like that, and of course their fans aren't going to be Vikings from the Middle Ages or anything like that. But the aesthetic they're appealing toward is that piece of history or something like that, right? And as I listen to that, I go, that's a really cool time in history. The Vikings were badass. I mean, they were evil, but they were badass, you know, and like it's just cool to think about and read about and so on. And that appeals to me. It interests me. This is a much more modern album. It's not making that kind of historical play or mythological play or anything like that. I'm not saying it's dated. I think this album is timeless. I think it's actually pretty iconic, and I think it does very well capture that piece of time in history or something like that. But it's not, it's not dated or anything. Like there's some music that it might still be good, but you hear it and you go, yeah, that was a product of its times, and that's kind of where it will stay. And I don't think that this is this. So I'm just saying there is an aesthetic in the similar to fashion that Amon Amarth appeals to Viking culture, Viking folklore or something like that. And I'm having trouble saying exactly what the aesthetic is. Asking me to describe it, and I may not have the vocabulary to say exactly.
Indie
kids, sure. But whatever makes indie kids tick more so than the indie kids themselves, that sort of thing. And whatever makes those kids tick, it just doesn't resonate with me, is what I'm saying.
And that's
just not
cool.
who I am. So that's just that's a barrier for me when listening to the music. Now the music itself, I mean, yeah, I think it's an interesting piece of music. I agree with you all that it's kind of angry, it's anxious, and that's part of, I guess that's part of what goes into that aesthetic. But that's something that's kind of a barrier to me in a lot of indie rock, I guess. And so I don't want to just shit on the genre or anything like that, because I think it's a good album, but again, it doesn't appeal to me in that sort of way. And so I will say though, the middle 3 tracks, I think it's A Different City, the cold part, Alone Down There, and The Stars Are Projectors actually have some really interesting compositional elements. And I think I compared them to some like Atmos sludge structuring. It's like kind of down tempo and slow.
The Stars Are Projectors. I was going to bring up The Stars Are Projectors. That song is pretty progressive. And the outro is like,
I agree.
We're going to talk about Godspeed later, and like we're getting like that like fucking awesome crescendo, heavy crescendo in The Stars Are Projectors that like I got pretty emotional first time I heard that song. Got me pumped in like a really in the way that like really good post rock can. And then they follow it up with Wild Packs of Family Dogs, which is like this short kind of whimsical, not whimsical, it's not the right word because it's a bleak song, but like this short folk track. And that transition was really cool. It was organic in a way that a lot of other bands wouldn't have been able to pull off. Structurally, this album should be a mess, but it isn't. There's just a lot about this album that I thought was really well done. And even though like I bring somewhat similar negative associations to it that Jake was talking about, but I don't know how else to say it. I've kind of grown out of those associations. That implies that I'm like looking down on Jake for having them, but I'm not. But for lack of a better word, I've kind of grown out of those associations, so it didn't bother me.
I know what you mean. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe it's just more time, more exposure than. Again, I heard this. I must have heard this before. Like I said, I've known people who like Modest Mouse, and I was friends with them. I've lived with them. Like I have no animosity towards indie kids or anything like that. It's just there's something about it. But I can tell James is not satisfied with my answer.
I think it's important to make it an object of your listening to try and to take the music away from those kinds of associations. I think that's hugely important, out of respect for the artist, because like whether or not there's something in it that a certain stereotype is interested in, I doubt very highly that the artist included that in the compositions with those people in mind. And so I don't want to diminish the music by referring it to the demographic to which it appeals the most strongly. They're like, I don't know, I'm listening to it for whatever the artist put in it, not necessarily for the effect it has.
Again, yeah, I want to put the I don't want to put the fans in the they are what's to be explained. They're not explaining why. Like the people themselves is not what explains like my barrier to entry here. So I'm again, yeah, it has nothing to do with like, oh, there's like people in particular I know, or I've seen them in on YouTube and at concert or whatever. That's not what the barrier is. There's, like I said, there's a quality in this music that I think tends to interest certain people. And the best way I can currently talk about it is to mention those people, and then everyone can kind of go, oh, I know what you're talking about, and you can extrapolate from there. It's more about the qualities than the people. I don't have any qualms with the people themselves or anything like that. And I hear you on wanting to listen to the music as an object for its own sake. I think that's really important. Right. But I also think it's impossible not to, unless you're listening to purely instrumental music, and even then, but it's impossible not to weave stories and have images in your head when you listen to stuff. This reminds me of this, or I don't know, like there's some music is a soundtrack for a movie, or can be set to it when you're reading a book, and it adds ambiance. Sometimes, I don't know, it replays memories you have from when you were a kid, or and sometimes it goes for a general sort of aesthetic, as I mentioned in the Amon Amarth thing, where it's it's Viking mythology, Norse mythology, and so I don't think you can entirely get out of that. To me, what you want to do is just not. You don't want to listen to the music. If you're trying to appreciate this sort of thing, you don't want to listen to it just for like, well, what can this do? You don't want to think about the utility of the music, like that sort of thing. The aesthetic or whatever, I think is implicit in all of this stuff. And of course, as Anthony points out correctly, I think is that we all bring individual interpretations to it. But I think there's an element of it that's not entirely conventional, or at the very least, it's common to a lot of cultures or something like that. Obviously, the indie kid in the United States is not a common to all cultures, but in some respect, I think people could learn to associate those things pretty easily. That's just kind of where I'm going with it. But again, yeah, I'm not judging this music on the basis of their fan base or anything. At least I don't think I am. I hope I'm not.
I think the two.
It seems to me like you're saying. It seems to me like you're saying that there's something psychologically different between you and the fans that are most interested in this kind of music.
Well, that's definitely true. I would say. I would not be surprised if that were the case.
I'm not sure it's as true as you might think.
Well, no. I mean, we're all people. We all like similar things make us tick. Like but. I don't know, there's just certain fashions and things. I mean, you talked about how you looked at the scene kids. Like, you can never envision yourself wearing skinny jeans and getting the swoop hair. And...
No, I've done everything I can to try and eschew that association when I'm listening to stuff that falls in that category.
Yeah, but I think...
Because, I don't think the association is necessarily wrong. But I don't think I'm not sure it's implicit in the music. I think it's more a raw association with people, not exactly about the music.
There's a step.
Even the name.
There's another like I don't know. It's a step removed. There's something in the music. It might not like no scene kid is not implied in Dance Gavin Dance, but there's something about that music that appeals broadly to that group, and whatever that is. I can't put words to it. I'm not exactly sure myself, but whatever that quality is, that's something that doesn't resonate with me. I just don't get that. I don't get jazzed by it. That's where I'm going. It's something unseen in the music that
It's just an interesting way to say that you don't care much for something.
Well, yeah, it's better to do that than just say I hate it or I don't like it and then not say anything at all. So I'm just trying to give an explanation.
Well, it just seems like a way of referring your lack of interest in it to something outside the music.
I mean,
but still saying it's something in the music. It's like there's something about this I don't know that I don't like. Whatever that is, other people like, and there's something psychologically distinguishing between me and those people. And that unites them. That's just an interesting way to talk about it, because it seems like we're not talking about the music.
I think we are. I mean, we're not talking about the compositions and the instruments and things like that, but I mean, it's a piece of art. Like, right? It's not just. It's not just
that's
physical.
The music.
Yeah, I just it's just to me that the piece of art isn't just the physical like medium. There's more to it than that.
I think that basically to straddle between the two of your positions, I unironically do kind of take a middle point. I think that I agree with Jim that the trying to strip aside context and associations and trying to be a little bit more objective with what you're listening to is a good goal. I think it's ultimately probably impossible to do it 100%, but I think it's a good goal. And I think you should instead attempt to do that, but understanding it's not 100% possible and just being aware of the biases and associations that you're bringing in and not letting them overwhelm you. but also not trying to get rid of them 100% because that's not possible.
Right.
So I take like basically a middle position, leaning a little bit more towards Jim, but taking kind of a middle approach between what you two are saying.
Yeah, I'm just worried we're talking past each other, which might be the case, but I think I'm in agreement with both of you on that case, like trying to remove that. But to me, there's a quality, like I said, there's whatever. Because I'm not a musician, so I can't talk about what they're doing compositionally. I can talk about how it makes me feel. I can compare it to other music. I might have a minimal vocabulary for this kind of music, and I could say some things about it. I couldn't tell you what key most of these songs are played in, or I don't have that.
I'm a musician, and I couldn't without a reference point.
Yeah. Okay. So I definitely can't. I definitely
I
can't.
need a guitar to tell you what key this is in.
Yeah. I definitely can't do that. So yeah. No, I'm just. Yeah, it's kind of airy and hand wavy. I recognize that, but there's a quality to this, and I don't have a name for it. But I was just trying to illuminate whatever that quality is by pointing to the fans, and hopefully someone can understand what I'm talking about. So that's why I'm trying really hard to say it's not the fans that makes me not like the music.
I mean, I respect you trying to.
And I do appreciate that difference. I appreciate the difference there. That is a difference. It's just an interesting way to describe it.
What I would like to say is, like, positively about this album. Again, I don't know much about Modest Mouse's music prior to this album. But if what you say, Anthony, is true, that people point to this as like maintaining our artistic integrity, I think that's great for this band that they were able to do that, move to a major label. And yeah, the songwriting is interesting. It's definitely interesting. I think it's kind of experimental, and it kind of meanders through all these various kinds of moods, which is really interesting. And I did enjoy a few tracks from the album as well. And yeah, maybe I just need to work a little bit harder, and I can come to like appreciate this more. But yeah, that's just where I am with it currently.
Yeah, I mean, I respect you trying to interrogate why you don't like it. It's better than just.
I do that with everything in my life constantly. It's a curse.
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel like most people, if they don't like something, just write it off immediately. And
yeah, I never want to do that. That unless it's like patently bad. Like there are some cases, but it's very rare when that happens. I think I don't even have an example in mind.
It's uncommon. Yeah. Tesseract is a good example of patently bad music.
Oh yeah. Altered State in particular.
Yeah, I mean, so sort of finishing out here, like, I have that same association with this music. Like, I'm coming to it with that same association, but I don't know. I'm unfamiliar with a lot of music that I think falls into this genre, this category, but there's a lot that I really like about it. The production techniques we already talked about, I think, make this particularly interesting. There's a lot of melody that's very good. This is melody forward singer-songwriter music. Especially considering the band context. It's not just a guy with a guitar and a voice. I don't know. I really think there's a lot here. I see why this is so popular for sure.
Isaac has like a huge amount of character as a vocalist.
Definitely.
He's not like a virtuoso singer, but he's not trying to be, and he has like a lot. He has like a unique and again like characteristic style. There are maybe some other singers I could compare him to from like maybe like other popular bands from the 90s, but for the most part, like, I think he's doing something that's like kind of his own with his singing, which is something I really like about Modest Mouse.
The lyrics I haven't paid a ton of attention to the lyrics, but what attention I did pay, I noticed that they're very they're very down to earth, the lyrics on this stuff. Like, even though they're dealing with fairly complicated subject matter, introspective subject matter, like we talked about, I think they're pretty down to earth, and I think that's something else a lot of people like about this.
Yeah.
In 2000, it's probably not super common for singer-songwriters to be saying fuck I think people probably like that about it. It sounds like someone's being honest with you.
Yeah, Modest Mouse are pretty vulgar in a way that most mainstream bands weren't really allowed to be, really.
Sure.
And yeah, they're like Modest Mouse are definitely pretty vulgar and have been since day one, and that's something I like about it because it's not just like straightforward angry punk music that's vulgar. It's like somewhat cerebral, but also but not very vulgar, but fairly vulgar.
This is a comparison that just popped in my brain. Do you see any parallels with Roy Harper in this stuff?
Like,
I don't know why,
like British.
but that seems to make sense to me intuitively.
No, I didn't get any like British folk rock from this. I'll have to maybe listen to it again with that in mind.
Which, by the way, this is the only American group we have on this list, right? The others are from the other Anglo countries, I believe. I think I covered the whole Anglo world pretty much.
Three are British and one is Australian.
Yeah, UK, US, and Canada. That's kind of cool.
Australia.
Isn't it? It's Australia.
There's
UK,
two
US,
UK,
Canada, and Australia.
Avalanches.
Yeah.
Who's the Canadian group?
Godspeed.
Yeah, Godspeed.
Oh, duh. I thought they were British.
They're Quebecois,
Disregard.
or however you say it. So, kind of going out of the Anglosphere. Let's move on to the next one.
Indeed. Yeah. Holy shit, we just spent 36 minutes on the first album. That might be a first.
That was a good conversation.
That'd be the longest we've ever spent on a first album here on TBN. Perhaps that will serve as a prelude to our Inevitable Aesthetics episode. All right, quite a departure here for number 2. Dopethrone by Electric Wizard.
Now this is a challenging album. Actually, this is a challenging album. I think.
No, it isn't. This album is pure awesome vibes from the very beginning till the very end.
This album is
pure awesome vibes.
When you get into one of these groups, there's only a couple ways you can get out. One is death, and the other is mental institutions. The guy saying that at the very beginning, I know that it's not Noam Chomsky, but it sounds exactly like Noam Chomsky, which makes me love it even more.
That's true.
Doesn't it? Doesn't it sound like him?
Yeah, it does. It does.
It does sound like Noam Chomsky.
And the other is mental institutions.
So, quick rundown on. So I know this is stoner metal, and I know the tropes of stoner metal. This is not something I want to listen to if I were stoned. Like this album is jittery and nervous, and maybe it's like weed-induced psychosis.
Nervous is an interesting
or
way
something.
to describe this.
What's that?
Nervous is an interesting way to describe this. You said that the other day, and I don't
see that at all.
It's honestly somewhat. It's like drone music in a lot of ways. It's like entrancing.
And it's rhythmic.
I mean, it's very rhythmic. The bass tone is complete smut, which I mean that in the best way possible. Like, I love it.
And the effects on the vocals are total smut too, in a great way.
Yeah, so distorted and nasty. And bass. I don't know, all these
guitars.
things. And I took a flyer on this album. I think I found it on some chart on RateYourMusic. I can't remember. I think maybe I was just looking at stoner metal. And I was like, okay, well, I should listen to this. And I did, and had a great time with it. But just, foreshadowing
warm
to...
and fuzzy, man.
Say again?
I think this album's warm and fuzzy, to be honest.
I don't get it.
It's kind of comfy, actually.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
It depends, again.
It
depends on the associations you're bringing into it. For
but
Jim
also,
and I, for Jim and I, it's comfy.
I mean, I get that. No, I think I get why it's comfy too. I definitely get that. There is a fuzziness to it. I think. I don't think that's wrong. But foreshadowing, there's another album we'll talk about later where I think it's like held up as the kind of standard of like Y2K paranoia, and I just don't get that association from it. But I'm also inferring from like how what it does to me physiologically. Like, this is one of these albums, we've talked about this in multiple episodes, where if I'm listening to this while I'm working, I will come to like 30 minutes later, I'm like, why am I so nervous right now? And I take my headphones off and I'm like, okay, I should listen to something more relaxed. So I get that it's stoner metal. I know the tropes and some of the history about this. You know, the band Sleep, I checked them out as well, and it's very similar. They're much slower and maybe even grimier than Electric Wizard in a lot of places. But
so stoner metal for me is basically, for a long time I didn't really think there was a difference between stoner metal and doom, and the difference isn't huge, but stoner metal is definitely way more up tempo, because this album is not like insanely plotting. Like immediately, you like when the album opens with Venom Sabathi, you get that sample that I already quoted, and then like it instantaneously goes into just like that crunchy ass bass and drum riff, like right off the bat. And like honestly, like first 20 seconds of this thing, and I'm in the world of the album until it ends. And yeah, if you haven't listened to this stoned, you definitely should. It's Dopethrone.
Oh yeah, no, the lyrics are that's obvious.
Yeah, there's a demon taking a
big ass bong
toke there
in the forest.
So here are the descriptors. Oh, you're looking at them now. So look at
some other demons.
Look at the descriptors for this album and tell me what about this doesn't make you feel nervous. Read off a couple of them for us.
What's the first descriptor? Is it drugs? I can't
heavy drugs, occult, psychedelic, noisy, nihilistic, dense.
This is all comfy for me.
That's the first
all
line.
Of this is comfy for me.
Ominous, infernal.
Yeah, I'm comfier in this atmosphere than in the Dona Nobis Pacem atmosphere. I don't want to be in the light of the Lord when I'm listening.
That'll make you really nervous.
I mean, I like dark, vile stuff. I like dark, vile stuff and always have, really. So, yeah, this is comfy for me.
I love heavy music.
Yeah, it's comfy. It's comfy for me, too.
I love heavy music. I'm not saying I can't be. That's the vibe I get from it. It's just one of those things that I couldn't relax to this album, but I enjoy the hell out of it. I can't relax to a lot of heavy music. I used to be able to when I was a teenager, but nowadays I can't listen to metal when I'm trying to relax as much as I used to.
There's also like this album is bluesier than I feel like people ever mention.
That's stoner metal in general.
Like the Electric Wizard and Queens of the Stone Age are not really that different.
I totally agree.
Like two bands that I absolutely love, and the album I always think of when I listen to Dopethrone as like similar, and one of the few that's comparable in quality is Songs for the Deaf by Queens of the Stone Age, which is like absolute S tier shit, and so is Dopethrone. Those are always the two like stoner albums of the 2000s that I think are like the two crowning jewels.
Is there any nostalgia on this? Because I know you guys are big black metal aficionados. Is it evocative of that?
This was a fresh listen. I'd never heard this.
No, I didn't get into Electric Wizard until I think it was actually last year, maybe a couple months ago. So no, not really nostalgia about the album specifically.
So what I mean more is here we are again, the quality of it. But like, yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I listen to music and an album I've never heard before, and the imagery it evokes is of like, I don't know, stuff I'd listened to in the past or something. And that might just be like a general sort of like, oh, it overlaps or has influences. Here's influences with music I've listened to before. But I was just wondering if it felt atmospheric in a way similar to some of the like more extreme metal that you all listen to. Because I like that stuff. I'm just not as familiar with it. So I just wondered if you have the reference point for that.
Atmospheric's not honestly a quality I would use for this stuff. I see that there.
Too much rhythm.
On the second line of the descriptors, but this is so much more just down and dirty, man. This is like, I don't know. This is like a couple of baked guys in their basement playing down-tuned fuzzy guitars, taking bong hits.
Yeah, it's like,
and that's not to diminish it in any way.
That's exactly what happened too.
I think that's exactly what they're going for.
Like yellowy bong water full of black flecks.
Shit in months.
Yeah,
it's been sitting in the box so long there are like bubbles like at the bottom of it.
Oh god. Oh god.
Dude, I mean, the slowness of this album is absolutely entrancing. Like, there's a moment halfway, it's about 7 minutes into the title track, where they break and it's a bunch of feedback, just a bunch of noise, and then they bring back the big fucking riff.
Oh god, so good.
They bring back the big riff, and it's just like just take it. I don't even know how to describe it.
And on Funeralopolis, the vocals
entrancing.
I listened to Funeralopolis once on earbuds, like super stoned, and like the vocals are just relentless. And I don't know if you could even really like notice unless you're stoned, but like the vocals on Funeralopolis are just like, he's like doing that drone with the vocals. He's like repeating the same like some fairly monotonous vocal melody for a long ass time on that track, and it doesn't let up, and it's just like, it's pure pleasure when you listen to that shit baked. I can't really explain why. Like, that's what's hard about stoner metal, is that like that experience of listening to music like this baked is like something that's difficult to verbalize. Yeah. It's something that's difficult to verbalize.
It's entirely possible. I mentioned before, I haven't, when we talked about the Pendragon album, I was like, I haven't listened to it the right way because I listened to it chopped up on YouTube. But so similar here, I may have just not listened to it the right way.
You don't have to be baked to enjoy it.
I don't know. Yeah, I didn't listen to this baked, and I really
I've listened to it sober and baked, and it's great both ways.
It's definitely great when it's...
Yeah, I mean, being baked obviously changes the way you hear it.
Best I have these bass boosting headphones, so I turn the slider up and listen to that nasty, disgusting bass, and it's great.
Yeah, I mean, this is in so many ways like just kind of an expansion on some of the stuff that Sabbath was doing. Like it's got this. There's, I mean, the heaviness of it, heavy in an abstract sense, not like the metalness of it, the actual heaviness of it.
Yeah, like this is an actual heavy album. A lot of music that says it's heavy isn't really. Like I was listening to Hinterland by Wobbler, which is a symphonic prog album that's fucking heavy, but it's symphonic prog. It's not metal. Like heaviness is almost ephemeral sometimes in music, but this album is fucking heavy. Dopethrone is fucking heavy. In a way, again, that's kind of hard to intellectualize.
Inagata Davida is heavy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you don't have to have breakdowns to be heavy. That's one way to be heavy, or they can be, but you don't have to.
You have to have breakdowns if you want to be based, but that's different.
Yes. Yeah, if you want the music to be good, you have to have breakdowns, but definitely not to be heavy. I love those bluegrass breakdowns.
I love how blurry the album artwork is too. I think that's hugely important.
Everything about this album art I love. Like the blurry ass, like you can't tell if they're trees or like weird like satanic priests or something. They kind of look like both.
These dudes?
Yeah, like there are those dudes, but then there are like the things behind him.
Those are evil black priests.
But then there are things behind him that look like they could be trees, but they also could be other black priests. It's fucking awesome.
This looks like a castle.
Oh, yeah, or a castle. That's good too.
I agree.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just Satan taking a big ass bong hit.
He's got this nasty beard too.
Yeah.
It's like a Tenacious D quality to it, but without sounding anything like that music.
I feel like this is like. I feel like this is such a nice medium. I feel like this is a nice like. Even though this is the 2000s, obviously it's the year 2000, like we're getting like the 90s depravity that made the 90s so great. They're hanging on to it here. Into the year 2000. Like, that kind of just like horror was everywhere in the 90s. Like we were reading Goosebumps and shit as a kid, just like, and Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Like the 90s were just like a dark time, and pop culture was very subversive, and it's cool to see.
Disco Volante was released on a major.
Yeah, exactly.
That's true.
And like the depravity of Dopethrone, I think, is kind of 90s. I think like this album is more of the 90s than it is of the 2000s, and obviously it's the year 2000, so we're straddling it.
There's always crossover in those early years that makes the decade divisions harder to draw.
And I think the Moon in Antarctica also straddles the two decades very much. So I think, honestly, I think probably all five of these albums do. So
yeah, I agree.
I think I agree as well, yeah.
All right, well, let's move on to number 3 here. Since I Left You by the Avalanches.
Another enormous vibe shift.
Yet another radical departure.
Yeah. I think this might be a masterpiece.
I think it might be a masterpiece
today. I think it might be a masterpiece. I described it as fun for the whole family. Like, this is, I don't know how you can't like this album. It shocked me. So
this is fun for the whole family. I see that,
and that's what I'd heard before about it, is that it's like an album that's hard not to like, and I definitely felt that way listening to it.
That to me is a sign of good quality. Yeah,
it's so warm.
Forces you to like it. Yeah,
warm is the right word.
A lot of this Plunder stuff is, so Plunderphonics, I guess, is one of like the subgenres this falls into, and one of the I guess one of the tropes is that they, or maybe it kind of fills out the whole genre, is that they take samples and rework old tracks and do something entirely unique and novel. So, like, 10 years ago, I would have thought, if you told me, and this music, obviously this music existed 10 years ago, obviously we're talking about 2000, but I just would not have believed that you could do something like this and make something so unique and interesting and fun. From songs that were themselves probably, or comedy skits in some cases, but to me, I guess, like, having never heard this, my impression would have been like, oh yeah, it's derivative, or like just make your own kind of music. That would have been shitty me 10 years ago. But now I listened to, I think the album that kind of opened it up for me was Donuts by Jay Dilla, which I discovered in graduate school like 4 or 5 years ago. And I didn't know an artist could do something like that, just make it entirely their own thing while sampling other people's work, which I think is a really cool thing to be able to do. Because there's a lot of ways that could go wrong. I feel like you're just like piggybacking off of what someone else has done, but in no way have the Avalanches done that on this. And I think any good Plunder music, Plunderphonics, would be the same.
Yeah. I mean, basically everything is completely repurposed. Every sample is taken, I would think, largely out of its original context.
Yeah, and like
and stitched into a new kind of collage.
And like in Frontier Psychiatrist, which is probably my favorite track on here, like it's like a collage of old movie samples that deal with like insanity, and the way that they're just like mashed together like that, even though they're all dealing with the same topic, and like the way that like they're put together and the way that they're sampled together is like really, really funny. In a way that like most of those samples probably were not funny in their original context, but the way that they're mashed together here is really, really funny. Like, I laugh out loud every time I listen to that song.
That boy needs therapy.
It's the opinion of the entire staff that he's criminally insane.
I'm just taken aback by his truancy as you are. Wherever she goes. But is expulsion the answer?
Expulsion isn't the answer. I'm afraid expulsion's the only answer.
I think that's taken from like a comedy troupe, like a skit show or something.
No, it sounds like it's taken from some like low rent 80s or like 50s horror movie. Although I could be wrong.
I think it was a comedy skit. I'm pretty certain about that.
It could be
skit, like an Abbott Costello type thing. I don't think it was them, but it was kind of like that.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff, and then of course there's sampling old like Sunshine Pop from like the 60s and stuff too.
Dude, that first sample in the opening track, what's it called here?
Since I left you, the title track.
Yeah, that opening like doo-wop bit is so comfy.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I would definitely
so
describe it as comfy. Yeah.
So ridiculously comfy, and it like I don't know. I think there's an inherent ambient quality to a lot of this kind of stuff to sampling music. Like. That might just be because it's not raw composition. It's almost like assembly. That's not to take the creative aspect away from it. Obviously, it's creative to make this music, but it's like, I don't know, in that assembly, it's sort of divorced from composition, I think.
Yeah, you have to focus on atmosphere really to get it to sound coherent.
Yes.
Like I said, this stuff could go wrong in a lot of ways, and so I think that's why I think it's really cool that they're able to make that work. There's like a unique appreciation I have for creating this kind of music. Just like taking care of the samples you're using, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, like I really respect any artist, whether a musician or an artist in other forms, who are able to like utilize technology in a artful and creative way. And that was going on a lot in the 90s with the Sampledelia and Plunderphonics, and then the Avalanches definitely. Maybe some people would consider this like the capstone of that sort of stuff. We're mainly talking about in the context of instrumental hip-hop albums like Introducing and Donuts, but this album is more soul than hip-hop, so it's kind of like a different approach slightly to the sample-based music. Because this isn't a hip-hop album.
Donuts wouldn't come out for another 6 years, I think, after this. So,
yeah, Introducing came out 4 years ago.
96.
Yeah,
4 years before this. 96.
4 years prior to this. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't heard Donuts, but Introducing is fucking incredible.
You should definitely listen to Donuts. That is a phenomenal record.
Yeah, I need to do that.
Phenomenal record. Yeah.
But yeah, I would ultimately call this like a soul album that... I'd call it like an experimental soul album that happens to be done entirely via sampling.
That's interesting, because I definitely thought of this more in a hip-hop context, but I see what you mean.
Really? I don't hear a whole bunch of hip-hop on here. I mean, there's obviously some. There's a crossover.
There's definitely that. I think the palette of it is disco, though. And one thing I wanted to say about it is I've learned... there's some music, I think, that you don't get the full experience of it unless you're moving. Like, obviously dance music, but there's other kinds of music as well. And again, this is probably just a subjective association thing, but I mentioned to James, I went for a run the other day and back in like 2014, I was getting in shape and I listened to Animals as Leaders a lot. And I know you guys don't like them as much as I do, but that's something I've come to associate with, and I feel like I got more out of the music when I'm moving. And so I've been listening to the new Animals as Leaders album while working out and stuff, and I just get more out of the album. And I felt this way about it too. The first time I listened to it, I was like, oh, it kind of sounds like Donuts, and I didn't write it off, but I was just like, okay, and obviously it was really good. And then I was going on runs and walks and stuff, and like got a lot more out of the music. Like, there's a groove in my step, and I felt like I needed to be moving while listening to it. And I always think that's a really cool quality to have in a piece of music, because there's some music where you kind of just want to sit with it. Like the Survivor Suite by Keith Jarrett, like it grips me, but I don't feel like I need to be moving around or anything like that. You know, that's just an example that comes to mind.
Some music is more cerebral.
There's a I mean, there's a calm to that kind of music that
there's a physicality to this music that I really like. I think.
Also, the music never stops on Since I Left You. Like, it never stops. Yeah. It's not like a suite in the sense of like a classical suite or anything, or like the way the Whirlwind never stops. But it's totally different than that. But the music never stops. So, like, all the tracks bleed into each other, and like.
So we talked about.
You don't have a breather, really.
Yeah, we talked about this with when we talked about Crack and Smack, that like a lot of those songs would work well on like a well-crafted playlist, and there's something cool about that. And that's kind of what I feel like maybe that's not what they were going for, but I kind of feel that way about it. It's like, I mean, there's still like there's a uniformity to it, but I think it kind of gives you that impression that it's, you know, it's like a really well-crafted playlist, and I think that's really cool too. It hit me the other day. I was like, this album is perfect. I think it's pretty close to being perfect, especially for what it's trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, even though it's like primarily fun music, like there's definitely like a lot of depth and layers to the way that they put the songs together. And when you really pay attention, you can admire like the layer after layer of sounds that they pack into like the way that they mash the samples together. Like, it's very rich. I would use that word to describe it.
Mm-hmm. Damn, yeah, what an album. It's one of the best. I think this is one of the best albums I'll have like discovered this year for the first time.
So, Jim, would you say that like your coming acceptance of electronic music has been gradual, or was there like a hard change at some point for you?
I'd say it was pretty gradual. There's some stuff I forced myself to listen to, and not like I strapped myself into a chair and fucking put those
Clockwork Orange
eye things on from a Clockwork Orange.
He's making me watch.
But no, I made a conscious effort to try and seek out, you know, the important pieces of electronic music, especially in the 90s when I was going through my spreadsheet, and I think by that time I had already become a lot more open-minded about it, having gone through some other stuff in the 80s that I think led up to it. And then there were a few albums in the late 90s that just really, really grabbed hold of me. Introducing being one of them, and the other being
Mezzanine.
Music Has a Right to Children by Boards of Canada, which I absolutely love. I've listened to that I've listened to those two albums just a shitload since I first heard them, and this is as good as those. This is every bit as good as those, but still unique.
Yeah. Introducing is more like progressive. I feel like
it's more it's there's a darkness to it.
I'm excited to get into that one. I'm
Introducing is obviously not a progressive rock album, even though there are progressive rock samples, but like I feel like that's a good electronic or sample based album for someone not familiar with it who's a fan of progressive rock. I think Introducing is a good entrance point.
Well, there are musical selections on there that are pretty challenging. Especially later on in Introducing, I can't remember which track it is, but there's a jazz composition that makes it on there, some jazz keyboard stuff that is pretty fucking heady. That always grabs hold of me when I listen to it.
And there's a track towards the end. I think it's
title.
I'm pretty sure it's Napalm Brain Scatterbrain. I'm pretty sure that it's has a really, really long. It's he basically creates a drum solo out of I don't think they're 808s, but they kind of sound like 808s. He makes a drum solo out of that. It's some classic rock drum solo almost, if you were to try to recreate it on a machine. That's kind of what he does, and it's really, really cool.
The track I was thinking of is Why Hip Hop Sucks, or no, Midnight in a Perfect World.
Yeah, Midnight in a Perfect World is kind of the magnum opus. That is a Pekka Bajola sample. Who was? You guys, have either of you two listened to the Pekka Bajola stuff? It's really good jazz rock from Finland from the 70s.
That sounds everything about that I like.
That's probably why I like it.
It's a good combination of words you just said.
Yeah, so I think we should talk about Plunderphonics in general too. I guess there's been some legal trouble with this stuff.
I was wondering about that.
I think Anthony, you know more about this than I do.
I don't know. The Turtles sued some rapper. I don't know enough details. All I know, I think it was either the late 90s or early 2000s. Some rapper sampled the Turtles. It's a band from the 60s that played with Frank Zappa.
You all know Happy Together.
Everyone's heard Happy Together. Although the Turtles are kind of a Nothingsville band, I don't really know how much people care about the Turtles. But
people know that song. No one knows who the fuck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They sued a rapper for sampling their shit and won, and it basically it didn't totally kill sampling in hip hop, but it dealt an extremely huge blow to it, and it's way harder to do now than it used to be. That lawsuit caused a lot of problems for hip hop musicians.
It set a precedent, right? So now any band who wants to get their bag can come after, so you're gonna have to pay more to use samples or something.
Yeah, you have to seek permission way more than you used to. I think it's fair use, so I think sampling music in the way that it's being done on an album like Since I Left You is fair use.
Well, it's very consciously being done. It's not like we're just taking this riff and then calling it that we wrote this, and then I can see giving credit in the liner notes to the samples. That would be, I think that's a good idea, but I don't see they're obviously not writing the pieces, and I don't think anybody with sense would listen to it and say, okay, this what they're doing is they're compiling a bunch of different reworking old stuff. I mean, what's the difference between that and a remix and putting it on an album?
Well, the remix is usually commissioned by the original artist.
So would it fall into the same sort of thing if I wanted to make a remix album of old stuff that I would need to seek permissions? I don't think you wouldn't be legally allowed to do so unless you had permission from the artist.
I'm torn on this stuff, because on the one hand, I do understand why an artist might think, well, you're out making money on what I originally published. Just give me my taste. I mean, I think that's the fundamental. That seems to be the fundamental issue there. But on the other hand, I have problems with IP in general, intellectual property. Yeah. So I don't really know where I'm at on it.
I think ultimately it is a fair use issue, and I think the vast majority of sampling in hip hop or plunderphonics and whatever falls under fair use. Because if you were to like listen to Midnight in a Perfect World and then listen to the Pajola song that he samples, like they're not the same song. They're extraordinarily different. It's being repurposed in a way that falls under fair use in my view.
I'm inclined to agree, but I don't have a solid opinion on this, at least not right now.
This is now a debate about intellectual property episode.
So
this is 3 hours.
This is a legal review. This is like a law journal.
We'll take a break and then come back. And
Harvard Law Review podcast.
IP. Yeah, the problem with IP seems to be that it's anti-competitive.
I haven't thought about it enough to have an opinion or to deserve an opinion.
I haven't either, not in any great depth.
I should think about it more, but I haven't.
Anyway,
two big kahunas next.
To number 2 here. Yeah. All right, lift your skinny fists. What's the rest of the title? One of you will know it.
Like Antennas to Heaven.
Like Antennas to Heaven by Godspeed, You Black Emperor.
Lift your skinny penis.
Yeah, another goddamn masterpiece, man. Now that would be a masterpiece. But no, this thing is fucking amazing, man.
Yeah, I mean, this is a recognized masterpiece. What's your history with this thing, Jim? I'm curious.
Probably heard it a long time ago. Didn't remember it. Listened to it again last week.
That's crazy. This album's been a major part of my life since I was like 16.
Yeah, I never really listened to this band back in the day, or if I did, it was more or less in passing.
This is a mucore album, isn't it?
Oh God.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
This is music nerd
like
apotheosis.
Yeah. No, yeah, this album's a masterpiece. There's something I think is really cool about post-rock, and I think when it's done well, is it can be listened. I mean, there are probably more ways, but there are two, in my mind, there are 2 ways you can kind of listen to this. One, as a sort of ambiance and enhancing whatever you're doing. It's like a mood improver or a mood alterer or something like that. And it's totally cool to listen to post-rock that way, and you can get a lot out of the music that way, and it can enhance whatever experience you're having. But the other way is that when it becomes so layered, because these tracks are very, very long. I mean, it's a 4-track album, and it's, an hour and a half long. I think they're all around roughly like 22 minutes or so.
Yeah, 4 sidelong albums. 4 sidelong tracks.
Yeah, exactly. Songs, and so, just the level of detail and like being able to then just sit down with the music and discover a lot of new things about it as you continually listen to it. And I think good post-rock does that. I think it gives you both of those opportunities to have it in the background, enhance. So like I think it was the end of Static, and it's not all positive, it's like at the end of Static, I mean, I get like, I went on a walk with that the other day, and I was getting creeped out. Like, it was like Resident Evil Silent Hill vibes. Like, it was terrifying to be walking out in the dark listening to that.
The sampling on Static is very, very unsettling. It takes dedication.
Yeah.
It takes...
Yes.
It's like I don't know if they altered the sample or if the original sample was distorted like that, but it sounds like some like lost tape you find in like some like abandoned insane asylum or something. Yeah,
it does sound like that.
Absolutely.
Like ranting
and
about
another
prayer.
Yeah, this is another album I think is really jittery and nervous, but in other ways it's really uplifting too.
Jittery
really
and
cool
nervous? What
juxtaposition
the
of moods.
fuck? Jittery?
Yeah, absolutely.
You're gonna need to explain to me how this album is jittery.
My man, I think you are just jittery and nervous.
Yeah.
Well, as someone who is prone to occasional bouts of paranoia, I have some insight into how
This album
works,
this
so-
album is like extremely long, slow building symphonies. How is it jittery?
I don't know, just some of the sampling. There's just a creepiness to it. I don't know. I get there's a creepiness to it.
There's a creepiness to it, but jittery implies that it's like fast and like moving a lot, which it's not. It's the polar opposite of that.
I don't know. Have you ever like gone into sleep paralysis and you wake up and you can't move, but it's nerve wracking and it's like that doesn't have to be fast. I don't know. That's kind of what I think.
Can't say I ever have.
Yeah, it's not fun.
I have. I sort of understand what you
It
mean.
happens to me all the time.
don't
So
get
I
it.
get what you mean. I just don't think jittery is the proper word for it. I'm just giving you shit for maybe not using it.
Yeah,
in this story.
maybe he might be right. I've said a lot of words tonight. I'm running out of gas. I don't know.
Unsettling in some ways. Like
I think it's
I don't know. It's
sad, really. I think is
Triumphant.
what this album is.
Triumphant's another great descriptor of this. I mean, it's really there's some really high highs and I think there's some low lows as well. Like I think it takes you through the full kind of spectrum of human emotion. That's one thing I really like.
I
about it.
agree.
The beginning of Sleep,
Yeah, I
like
agree.
the first,
it runs the
first
gauntlet.
half of Sleep is some of the saddest music ever put to tape. With the sample about the guy like bemoaning Coney Island's decline is
Yeah,
just like
that
makes
is
you
really
want to
sad.
cry, and then it just like it builds
Best
into
place to be
basically
in the world.
yeah, they don't sleep anymore on the beach. And then like it,
Yeah.
and then it like transitions into that long like just it's like a funeral dirge to those cellos that dominate like the whole first half of Sleep. It's fucking beyond melancholy. Like it's like in high school like with this album there were a lot of times where I like couldn't listen to it in high school because it like made me too sad. Like I'm more emotionally stable now than I was as a teenager, but as a teenager like there were times where I had to turn this album off because it was just like making me depressed. And it's instrumental music other than the samples, so that's like a pretty huge achievement. And it's also very narrative music despite the fact that it's instrumental, which is a characteristic of a good symphony. And I think this fundamentally is basically like modern classical. It's just played with rock instruments, and that's kind of the definition of what post-rock is anyway.
I was just gonna say that.
So like I think if you are having any trouble getting into Godspeed, I think like the best way to maybe approach it is to approach it like classical music. Because if you approach it like wanting rock music, you might either be bored or not know what to do with it.
Yeah, because like it's not just ambient. I think there's a fundamental distinction there. I don't think this is just ambient music. Like it's not just meant to be, background music.
No, it's very narrative. Like it there are movements.
Yeah,
It's like read like the characteristics of what a symphony is in some like classical music 101 textbook, and like all of it applies to this album. In my view, and
yeah, I think that's the right way to describe it.
And
So I'm wondering about the stylization of the band name. So I know that it's Godspeed You, Black Emperor, right? So the exclamation point goes after the U. I see it written that
That's
way.
always what I thought.
Yeah. I don't
When
have
they
anything
started
else interesting
out-
to say about that, but yeah.
when they started out, it was just the exclamation point at the end, but they changed it with this album. Or they might have changed it on Slow Riot for New Zero Canada, the EP before this.
They also
But
go
I
as
know
God's
on-
P, right?
F.8 or F sharp, A sharp, Infinity. I'm pretty sure it was stylized with
Another
it at
great
the
one.
end. Yeah.
Yeah. That's another masterpiece.
Godspeed are also very super, super anarchist and political, but I think Lift Your Skinny Fist is probably their album that is the least that way, or at least the least overtly that way. Which I don't think is good or bad, but I do think in order to maybe understand the full context of Godspeed, you should listen to their other stuff, at least for that reason.
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
gonna
F
mention.
sharp is much more political.
And
than
Slow
this.
Riot is extremely political. It has that long rant from Blaze Bailey Finnegan III, as he called himself.
How much political content was in the newest one? I don't remember as much. In Godspeed at State End.
Godspeed at State's End, as the title indicates, was pretty political. I mean, it's instrumental music, so there are no lyrics other than the samples, so it can only be so overtly political. Yeah. But it's about as overtly political as instrumental music can be.
Yeah, sure.
No, there haven't been nearly as many samples in Godspeed's work after this album. All their stuff after, Yankee UXO has... I don't know if it has any. If it does have any samples, it's not very many. And then Alleluia, Don't Bend Descend has one brief sample at the very beginning, but I think that's it. So they kind of moved away from that. But the way that the samples are, it's just one sample per track, and the way that they're done is really, really important. And is one reason why this album is genius. And one of the samples, the one on Intent Is to Heaven, the last track, the sample is a sample of a song, which is always interesting. It opens with that folk sample.
That's a very atmospheric track, the last one, compared to some of the others. There's less. I feel like that was much more just a straight atmospheric track.
Yeah. Static is probably the spooky, dark ambient track.
It definitely is, yeah.
Sleep is the depressing track that moves into a giant crescendo. I feel like the back, I talked about the front half of Sleep. The back half of Sleep is the definition of a post-rock crescendo. If you wanted to explain what a post-rock crescendo is, just play the back half of Sleep. And that gets me excited every time I listen to it. That slow build crescendo in Sleep.
What's your background with post rock, James?
Non-extensive. Yeah, I mean, there was another episode where we talked about post rock, and I can't remember what.
When we talked about Pat Metheny and Lyle Mays.
Ah, yes.
Was that it? I know we talked about it then, but was that the only time?
We probably talked about it when we talked about Felt, too. And also Bark Psychosis.
Bark Psychosis.
That was it.
Yes.
That was it. That's where we talked about it.
I remember all those, but that's
so honestly, just... Yeah, non-extensive. I don't have much of a history with this music. I've listened to some other Godspeed You stuff in the last couple of years, just because I was obviously on my spreadsheet with all the Pitchfork core that I added, and I really enjoyed that stuff when I listened to it. But I don't think I had really heard this probably until about a week ago.
So of course, Sigur Rós is maybe the one that I think I think that's a more mainstream post rock album. I don't know if you've heard that one, and then.
Explosions
Would you all count
Sky?
Swans? Huh?
Explosions in the Sky.
Explosions in the Sky is another pretty popular one.
Mogwai, too, is popular.
And would you guys put Swans in this category?
Swans, I think you could call them post-rock, yeah. At least the post-reform stuff. I think you could call it post-rock. Yeah, I think experimental rock is a better term for Swans, but I would not object to anyone calling it post-rock.
Right.
I mean, it's hard to listen to Swans and think about rock in any kind of context.
Yeah.
That's some jittery shit. Or maybe
especially if you think about rock in its original context.
That's some challenging shit, the Swans.
I love Swans.
But yeah, all
right.
I think cinematic is another good way to describe Lift Your Skinny Fists.
I agree.
There's such a clear narrative quality to the album that is hard. You can't explicate a plot of it because there obviously isn't one. But it takes you on a journey, definitely. And people also always talk about how this album is very apocalyptic, which it definitely is. but it can be hard to pinpoint why. Like, why does the music make you feel why is the music apocalyptic? Like, it is, and I think everyone agrees that it is, but I can't really explain why. And I don't know, I think that's kind of beautiful that I can't really explain why.
I think this is I think this is a masterpiece as well.
Right now, the
All right, shall we move on to number one?
real big kahuna.
Kid A by Radiohead.
Yeah, this is my favorite Radiohead album for sure. Most people say either Kid A, OK Computer, In Rainbows, or The Bends as their favorite Radiohead. It's usually one of those four, and Kid A is definitely mine.
I've only heard... What have I heard? I've heard Pablo Honey. And
Well, Creep is the best Radiohead song.
That's
of course.
Yeah.
Creep is actually the only Radiohead song I've ever heard. I've never heard Kid A. I'm going to try to bullshit my way through us talking about
I watched a video about Creep today and what they were doing musically. It was
based.
kind of interesting, actually. They were doing the like major, minor, what do they call them? The relative shared keys. Like they took the notes that were common to the major and minor. It's like why it was one of those things like why is this song good or something like that. And,
Was that Rick Beato?
no, I don't remember the guy's
it
name.
Vox?
I wish I would plug. I can't remember. I would plug his channel, but I forgot. Maybe we'll put that in the notes or something.
Vox
for the
did a video on Videotape, the song.
No,
the
it
closing
wasn't-
Song
it wasn't
on
Vox.
In Rainbows. The Vox video on
It wasn't
Videotape is good
Vox.
though.
Yeah, we'll plug the guy's YouTube channel. Apologies, I forgot your name.
But Kid A is an album. Some like people who aren't. This is going to sound pretentious, and I guess it is. But like people who aren't that familiar with experimental music tend to talk about Kid A as if it's like the most radical thing ever made, and it's not. But for the mainstream, it like this is among as radical as a mainstream rock album could possibly be. I think within the context of mainstream rock, this is pretty radical. It's not an easy album to penetrate at all. It took me years to. I didn't like this when I first heard it in high school. Now I would consider it a favorite.
Yeah, I loved this. I like this better than OK Computer.
I do for sure. There's a huge amount of krautrock influence on here, on the national anthem in particular. If you have that as a reference, that helps you. I think the thing that finally got me to love Kid A is I first heard it in high school, didn't like it. Then I got into krautrock in late high school, early college. And then, like, when I had the context of krautrock, that got me to... That was my in. That was, like, my path into Kid A. And then that got me to love it.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. Like, I didn't have to warm up to this at all. I honestly don't think I'd ever listened to it.
That's crazy.
I vaguely remember, like, trying Radiohead in high school, but it never did much for me, so I don't even remember listening to this. I wonder if I would have liked it as much as I do before I'd become interested in electronic music, like we were talking about earlier, because there's just an obvious electronic element to this music. But I loved this on the first go around. Absolutely loved this. I mean, I got hooked from like the first moment.
Yeah,
the first moment of this.
That I don't know what exact keyboard he's playing on that intro to Everything in Its Right Place. It might be like I don't know if it's like a Fender Rhodes. I don't know what it is, but whatever tone he has on that electric piano at the very beginning, yeah, like it's instantaneously like
That's
awesome.
That's some deep house like IDM stuff that right there, and that's all. I think that's all over this record.
And then the title track, the vocal effects,
absolutely
the vocal
so
effects on Tom York's vocals
yeah.
on the title track are like they're so buried. Like his vocals are so buried and distorted that it's like it's honestly really weird. Like I don't know if I've ever heard of a vocal effect exactly like that anywhere else than what you hear on the title track. It's super, super weird, and I love it a lot. The way that his vocals are buried in the mix on there. They just got really creative. They just they're just being really, really, really creative all over this. without being like too self-indulgent, and that can be a hard balance to strike, and they struck it really well on here in my opinion, and in a lot of people's opinion, because this album is acclaimed.
So yeah, that actually leads into one thing I wanted to talk about here. What do you guys think it means for a band to be experimental? Why use that classifier?
James and I had a lengthy exchange about this the other day, in part anyway.
I think it's relative. I think for a band that had mainstream success like Radiohead, an album like Kid A is unquestionably experimental. In the broader music context, like the totality of music, this probably is relatively not experimental. I think it depends on what you're comparing it to, really. I think experimental is generally a term of comparison.
I worry that the word I worry that experimental falls into the same trap as progressive. It might not really be useful as a descriptor of the music itself. It might be interesting, like as a way of talking about music in some kind of historical context, like eventually. But beyond that, I don't see how you could really use it other than to say, well, the band approached, or the band or the artist approached the songwriting and the recording, aiming to, to experiment with different sounds or composition techniques.
To subvert.
I'm just not sure what it means beyond that. Like
to subvert genre
convention
expectations while remaining within it. I mean, that's the thing about a lot of experimental music. Unless it's like real wacky. I mean, this is still like alt rock, like characteristic 2000s alt rock.
I'm skeptical that artists do that in the first place. I don't. It's hard to imagine an artist going into something with the idea that they're just going, well, I want to subvert categorization.
There's literally a genre called rock
project.
and opposition. Like
that was political.
No, I know, but I don't think it's. There's so much music that gets classified as experimental, and I don't think most of it is going in with that.
That's a problem.
With that intention.
I can't get into the head. I can't get into the head of Tom York and Johnny Greenwood and the members of Radiohead when they made this album, but I think it's possible that they went into making this with the idea that they wanted to subvert expectations. I think I think listening to the music, there might be some evidence of that, because there's so much on here. There's a fully ambient piece, Tree Fingers. There are dance pieces. There are really weird moments like that vocal effect on the title track that I already brought up.
The only moment with any driving rhythm is the national anthem, I think, right? You've got that bass line.
Optimistic definitely has a dance quality to it. But yeah, not quite in the same way. Experimental, I think, is generally a term of comparison, and I also think it could also be a term for performance. Like if you listen to like a John Zorn alto sax improv, like he's playing the instrument in an experimental way, like he's doing things to the alto sax that are not conventional.
Sure.
And that's just an example. And on an album like Kid A, like there are things happening with the way the instruments are being recorded, the way the vocals are being processed through effects that are unconventional. And so I think calling it experimental makes sense.
I think
yeah.
That's what I mean, though. Like, is that what it means to be experimental? Is it that the band went in and said, "I want to play with some sounds"? Because I don't think that's what most people mean when they say something is experimental.
I think it's generally just a synonym for unconventional in common usage.
What do you think people mean when they say experimental? James wrecked with facts and logic.
No. I'm really thinking.
Watch.
I'm trying to come up with it. I'm trying to give you an answer without being an asshole. I think a lot of people are just being assholes when they use the word experimental to describe some music.
They're being assholes? Like they're using the word experimental to like insult the music? Is that what you mean?
No. Not that they're being
to insult
mean.
music that's not experimental, i.e., music they don't like.
They're
Is that what you mean?
I think people are trying to make more out of the writing process of in the compositions.
You know, I was surprised Anthony said what he
and
what
not
he said.
in a bad and not that it's bad not to be quote experimental unquote.
So I share some of your reservations, and I was surprised to hear Anthony say what he said immediately, that like this is called experimental, and then he said it's really in the context of a lot of it's not that experimental, and that was one of the first. I think I even mentioned that to you, James, the other day when we were talking about it, and I was like, I don't know how experimental this actually is. Like in some ways, I mean, I think System of a Down might be more experimental in certain areas, and they came out around.
But I don't know what that means either.
I disagree.
I think it might just be a stupid descriptor.
I disagree with what Jake said, that this is like still 2000s alt rock. I mean, that maybe that general shell is still there, but like Put on Tree Fingers, that's not even a rock song. It's an ambient piece. Like Put on Optimistic, that's not really a rock song. It's like an electro house piece. Put on the title track Kid A, I don't even know what that is. It's hardly rock. Most of this album isn't even rock, much less like standard 2000s alt rock. So I don't know if I agree with that.
No, I guess that's right. Like I said, I think the only driving kind of like rhythmic part, like the bass, is the national anthem. Yeah, I guess I stand corrected on that now that I'm thinking about it.
The framework is still there of that genre, so like
maybe that's what I meant, but I'm not sure.
Although, also, if this would have been the debut album from Radiohead, we might not view it as much that way.
Well, no, because it would have already existed, right? And then,
well,
although, I mean, so a band can experiment with its own sound. That's one thing that can happen. And then another thing is a band can take what other people have done and try to experiment with that and go beyond those. So I guess people kind of, I don't know, sometimes music can be kind of formulaic and predictable. And so there's a kind of unpredictability with it, and then trying to control for those. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, it is kind of weird in a way, because when you do an experiment, you're trying to make predictions about it. That's so the descriptor might not be apt in that sense, because you're in a way trying to make it less predictable. You know what I mean? It's like there's less of a control. So calling it experimental is kind of weird in that sense. But also experimental in the sense of like, hey, let's try this and see what happens. Like I think that's kind of the gist of the idea.
The term experimental is problematic for that reason, I think, because like an experiment implies that you don't know what the result will be. That's like the definition of what an experiment is.
No, I think an experiment is like you already have an idea of what an answer to your question would look like, and then you test it. Like that's what an experiment is.
Yeah, but
like
you
a
don't.
Scientist, when he does,
But you don't know for sure.
What an answer to his question would be like.
But you don't know for sure, which is why you have to do the experiment. Like
you don't know whether what you're testing is true or not, but you have an idea of like how things will go. It'll either go this way or this way, and you know, like in order for the experiment to work, you have to already have in mind like the criteria for failure or success in the experiment.
Yeah, exactly. And you're not certain whether it will succeed or fail, which is why you perform the experiment. And none of that really, I think, applies to the process of making music. Not really.
Yeah, I mean, they're not searching for truth in that's not happening. I don't think when they write. I don't know of any artist who would do that.
So for that reason, I think unconventional is probably a more apt word than experimental.
Yeah, I don't know. Experimental just has this. I think there's an implication in calling something experimental that the music was written with the intention of, like, the differentness of the music was there for its own sake, and I doubt that that's the case for a lot of music that happens to be called experimental. Like, I read about the writing process for Kid A, and it's like, Tom York heard sounds in his head, and they wrote the songs, and they played them, and they recorded them.
Yeah, if they were just like trying to be,
it just happened. I think it's more that it happened to be different than that it was written with the express purpose of being different.
You don't think artists ever do that?
Like, I think some artists do it. I think it's usually probably a bad idea. I think most of the time what artists are doing is just recording some version of something they heard in their heads.
Yeah, I think
that's the most common type of musical creativity is spontaneous occurrence, not purposeful composition.
in music that's like trying to be a middle finger to someone normally is not experimental music. It's normally more straightforward.
That's
music.
kind of exactly what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
But like with Kid A, like
I don't know. I'm skeptical.
If they had attempted to, if their intention with Kid A was just to like make something bizarre, then it probably wouldn't be good, and no one would care about it anymore.
That's what I mean.
Yes. Like,
okay, then yeah, I think that's fine. But even then, there's still like a third personal way to talk about this, right? We can get outside of the intentions of the artist, and it's like, what does this music do compared to other music that was coming out, or compared to a previous sound of theirs? Like, does this subvert expectations for a particular genre, or what a rock band should be or do, or something like that?
And this album
I
definitely
understand
does
an
all those
experiment
things.
implies an intention, but
yeah. that's the historical that's the historical element of that conversation. I think that's where that label makes more sense.
But also, I mean, a band could go into a writing process.
I don't know. It seems weird to describe experimental as like a kind of a genre.
Yeah, I mean,
or a descriptor of the music as an object. I think it's odd.
I mean,
it's the same way with progressive, like like I think it's most interesting as a historical description, like not as an actual genre description.
I agree with that, for sure.
yeah,
Kid A is a weird example because it's an album that is certainly unconventional by any kind of mainstream pop or rock standards, but also has a very, very wide audience. Like, people on the street know this album. It's like entry-level music nerd stuff. So a lot of people talk about it in the context who aren't like enormously experienced with the broader progressive or experimental music scene. So I think it might get discussed in those terms more often just because of how well known it is. But those sorts of contexts and like social contexts are important and unavoidable, so I don't really have a problem with experimental being applied to at least this album.
I don't know. I think my skepticism ultimately comes down to an irritation when people make psychological claims about about an artist's compositional process.
Yeah, and I
think artists never.
I think it's just an unfortunate synonym for unconventional. Again, like, I think that would be the better word, and for whatever mistake of the way the language evolved, experimental is the word that's used instead. And like,
yeah, I think that's.
And I think that definition is like understood
that way. It's probably fine.
Yeah, that definition is like disambiguated enough at this point that I don't have too much of a problem with it.
Yeah, I think like the most like the clearest example of like an experimental artist or composer would be like whatever the hell Berg was doing with his like atonal weird shit in Austria and Vienna in like the early mid 20th century. That like definitely subverted, and that was very deliberate, and it was political in a lot of ways too, though, which isn't necessarily inherent in Kid A. I don't think it's there at all, really. Maybe barely, but probably not much.
Yeah, OK Computer is very political, but Kid A, not as much. The same kind of like post-technological angst that people say defines Kid A so much, which it does. It's I think the feelings are still there on. Did I misspeak just now? The post-technological angst that people say defines OK Computer so much is definitely on OK Computer. It's not there as explicitly on Kid A, but I think that a lot of that sort of emotional core still carries over to Kid A.
I don't get much of it at all. That's what I meant with like. So I mentioned earlier like foreshadowing about like angst or paranoia or anxiety, like Y2K variants of all of that, and I don't get much of it at all on this album. I think, James, you mentioned it as chaotic, and that can lend itself to feelings of like unease or anxiety, like not knowing how things are going to turn out. And that might also be what people mean by experimental, just being we said unpredictable or indeterminate or something like that, leaving things up to chance and whatever. But I don't get as much of that on this. In some ways, I think the way I put it is I detect something of an identity crisis on the album. And actually that might be, the joke might be on me in that sense, because maybe that's like the beauty of it and I'm missing it. But in some ways, like, the vocals in a lot of ways to me are kind of there to be kind of like panicked or something, and then you've got this like really calm underlying almost IDM like deep house beat going on in the background. And it's a weird juxtaposition, and I just can't wrap my head around it. But like you said, Anthony, the first time you heard this stuff, you didn't like it as much, and I listened to this stuff maybe a few times in 2015, 2016, and I didn't really return to it. And I know that these are two different bands, but I'm not the only person who made this comparison, but Porcupine Tree comes up in the same vein as Radiohead sometimes. I think there are enough comparisons there where it's interesting enough. I know they're not doing the exact same thing, and they're not strictly in the same genre or anything like that, but Porcupine Tree has some of those, like the angsty kind of nervous, like In Absentia is what I think of. It's like being a high point in Y2K anxiety.
Marillion too have like a lot of similarities to Radiohead.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, they're not. It's not a perfect. I mean, no two bands are really going to be a perfect carbon copy. Some are closer to others, and I really don't know who else would be close to Radiohead, at least on this album. And this album is not a whole lot like any of Porcupine Tree's albums, but that is a comparison people make. But I just don't get as much of that on this album. But again, I might just need more time with it. I definitely felt that way about OK Computer, that it was much closer to what Porcupine Tree was doing. And in that vein, I tend to prefer Porcupine Tree. But again, I know James doesn't think they're as close as maybe I do, at least on OK Computer.
I think that I don't know. I try not to compare contemporary artists, like simultaneously contemporary artists, too much, because I don't think that they're riffing on what each other are doing so much.
And I wasn't implying
that. I think a lot of contemporary artists probably aren't even aware of lots of other contemporary artists, because what they're doing is, composing probably what they hear, which is probably some kind of strange blend of all of their influences from
that's the
other music they've been listening to.
That's the solitary genius hypothesis. How far can people go to take art or science or anything like that? Was Newton just sitting in his chambers thinking all of this stuff naturally? The hand of God touched him, and he just had an idea about, I don't know, inverse square law or something like that. But then other people say, no, like anything we do as humans, it's like going to be bound up with what other people. We're gregarious and social, and more than that, I think we're like at bottom like social beings, and so I think it's unavoidable, and it really just also depends on the scene as well. Like, I think we'll be doing a prog metal episode here soon, and that's an example where, like, in the 2010s, a lot of those bands are writing music together, they're touring together, they're sharing ideas. Some of the there's not as much of it, but there's some overlap between the bands. Some people produce other bands' albums and that sorts of thing. So it depends on the scene and how close the bands are. But I would be surprised if Tom York didn't know anything of, like, was not listening to Porcupine Tree. He may have not cared for it, or like he may have not sat down and listened all through it. But I know Steven Wilson was paying attention to what Radiohead was doing. He mentions it in one of the album years episodes where they talk about what's the album that came out in between In Rainbows, or maybe it came right after In Rainbows. It's the red one, I think.
Oh, in between. Well, there's Kid A, then there's Amnesiac, then there's Hail to the Thief, then there's In Rainbows.
That's the one. Yeah, Amnesiac, and I think Steven Wilson mentions how he was like kind of following. I could be wrong on that, so someone could check me on that, but I'm positive that he was following.
I don't mean that artists are writing completely in a vacuum, and there's certain to be crossover. I just think it's more retrospective. It's more likely retrospective than as like some kind of like asynchronous social collaboration in some kind of grander scheme.
It depends. We mentioned in our in the I think Prog Classics episode, or maybe it was in the Canterbury when we were talking about the Canterbury scene. We mentioned how these guys were like, I think you even mentioned it, James. You were like, yeah, these guys are in some ways kind of like trying to outdo each other. Like they're trying to play better than the other guy, and like there's not that it's like
I think
highly cutthroat
that's
or competitive.
specific.
Yeah,
I think that's more specific to music that's to jazz music or music that's jazz adjacent, because so much of it is in a performing context. What can you do physically with your instruments, and what can you do in terms of your improvisational ability?
that's probably true.
With stuff that's more strictly compositional, like a Radiohead or a Porcupine Tree, I think there's obvious crossover. I'm just skeptical that I'm skeptical that it goes deeper than common influence.
Common influence, or I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they were inspiring each other in some way. Maybe if they don't even realize it, but that wouldn't surprise me.
Maybe
we pick up information like that all the time.
That's definitely possible.
Yeah, stuff causes you to behave in certain ways you wouldn't even realize, and that could be a thing. It's in the air. I mean, it's part. That's why we call it a zeitgeist. You know.
I think there's probably more influence on Spilson from Radiohead than the other way around.
I would not be surprised by
That's
that.
what I would expect also.
Are we going to rank these bitches? This is a tough one to rank.
I think I've got mine.
I've got mine, actually.
Yeah, I think I've got
I
mine.
have mine, but it's tough.
Mine.
Yeah, it is tough.
Mine's easy.
Okay.
Yours is easy? This is a killer list.
Mine is 5-1.
Okay.
Exactly as we presented
All
them.
right.
Oh, really? Dang, okay.
Yep.
Oh, wow. I was waiting
Yep.
for something else. Like, okay, I gotcha. Interesting.
All right, Jake, what's yours?
Yeah, 5 would be the Moon in Antarctica. 4 would be Kid A. 3 would
Damn.
be Dopethrone. 2 would be Since I Left You, and 1 would be Lift Your Skinny Fists.
So this is honestly a really, really hard ranking for me because these are 5 killers. But 5 would be Since I Left You. 4 would be The Moon in Antarctica. 3 would be Dopethrone. 2 would be Kid A. And number 1 would be Lift Your Skinny Fists. But with a list this high quality, simultaneously high quality and eclectic, a ranking is as ad hoc as it gets, at least for me.
This one goes deep, man. I wonder how many. I mean, so Lift Your Skinny Fists and Kid A are both in the top 30. The top 30 all-time albums on Rate Your Music. I wonder how many years top 5 on Rate Your Music have more than one album that's that high on the overall list.
Well, it's interesting too. I feel like the fan base for this website is probably people in their like our age to mid 30s. So this stuff was coming out or had just been released when we were just getting into music, and I think it skews towards that. Of course, in the Court of the Crimson Kings in the top 10, maybe top 5. So
there's definitely no shortage.
That,
there is no shortage of Zoomers on Radio Music.
That's true.
True.
That's true. But yeah, let's mention some other like a roundup retrospective for a couple other things that didn't make the top 5, and 2 that I wanted to mention just because there's a whole lot of stuff to cover, and I don't want this to take too long. But 2 that I really, really enjoy from this year are The Unseen, Quasimodo, aka Madlib. Funny story about that album, when he went to record it, so normally, I mean, you just hear him in his normal voice rapping, and he has this like almost chipmunk like vocal effect on the entire album, and it's really, really schizophrenic and weird in a lot of places. Really low-fi as you'd expect from Madlib, but I'm pretty sure he did acid like every day for like a month or 2 and recorded the album.
That sounds awesome.
I think it comes through on the album. I might be reading that back into it, but that's always cool. And then another I wanted to mention was From the Yearning to Burst, the Perpetual Circle by Koyanis Katsi, which was this symphonic prog metal band, almost all instrumental, very cinematic, big open sound. And they released one album and then fell off, and I don't know exactly why, but I think that's one of the most underrated symphonic metal records of all time, and I highly recommend that one. But there's a bunch of others on this list too.
Yeah, 2 pretty great symphonic prog albums from 2000 are Space Revolver by the Flower Kings and 5 by Spocksbeard. And also another 2000 release I just remembered was A Skeptic's Universe by Spiral Architect, which is like tech metal to an outrageous degree. Very similar to like Ron Jarzambek stuff. That's an awesome tech metal album if you want to listen to something that's just like actually is wanky. I don't like that term, but if you want to listen to something that actually is like that but also really fun, that Spiral Architect album is pretty awesome. Do you know that thing, Jim?
Do you know who
Don't
You
know.
know, I'm assuming
Do you
you
know-
know it, right, Jake?
Yes, yeah. Do you know who Roger Scruton is or was? He passed away recently. He was like a philosopher, like a aesthetician.
Yeah, philosopher.
He did a lot of lectures on art and whatever, and he actually mentions that in the lecture, which is like the weirdest juxtaposition.
He mentions A
that actually
Skeptic's
got me.
Universe.
Roger Scruton mentions.
I think it's he mentioned Spiral Architect in like a Q&A section in one of his lectures. And he wasn't prompted. Like he knew about the album and he had listened to it, and I think he enjoyed it, which I thought was just a cool
highly based.
thing. Yeah,
And
Rest in peace.
unbelievably based.
Yeah. White Pony by Deftones
There's
came
a lot
out
of
this
good
year
shit in
as well,
2000.
which is another banger.
And
Yeah, I mean that's a huge album. That's in the top 10 on Rate Your Music. So is Relationship of Command by At the Drive-In.
Speaking
Top
of
10 for
Porcupine Tree,
2000, that
Lightbulb Sun had come out this year, so that's another, just for the reference, what we were just saying with Radiohead.
yeah, Lightbulb Sun is some
Very
of,
different album though.
yeah, that's some of their best work. Pretty killer year for music, honestly.
Got a King
Some
Crimson
good video
album
game,
that year.
some video,
Construction of
some
Light.
good video
Oh,
game
yeah.
soundtracks for this year. Majora's Mask, Banjo Kazooie came out this year. Yeah, some good stuff.
Yeah, 2000, that's when Rare was in their prime.
Yeah, they weren't just a Microsoft studio. And they actually put out good games. Conker's Bad Fur Day, you remember that?
Yeah, that was probably 2002. Perfect Dark, was that 2002?
Perfect.
2000 as well, is what I mean to say.
I think it was 2000. Perfect Dark was great.
Yeah, Rare.
I think Donkey Kong 64 was another great. Diddy Kong Racing. Yeah, there's a bunch. Rare was on point in early 2000.
Yeah, what a time. Pokemon Gen 2 came out.
Oh yeah.
That's true. I think Pokemon Stadium 2, had come out around that, like after the Gold Silver dropped. Yeah, good times. I was 6.
Yeah, 7. Alrighty. Yeah, hell of a list today. Jesus.
Yeah, one thing I mentioned is that we all had a lot to say about all of these, so like them or not, which I think you guys liked all of them. I was not as high on a couple of them, but they still got me to say a lot, and I think that bodes well. It's always good when you have a lot to say about, when it stimulates you to be able to talk about it, and they're all pretty easy to talk about in a strange sort of way, which was, I don't know.
But
it's
they're
kinda-
all so. They all have so much character.
Yeah, I agree.
There's so much character.
Yeah,
on
these
these
are
albums.
5 albums
Yeah,
that
this
are
is-
not boring. Like, I think they're almost...
No,
I don't...
Definitely.
Even if you don't care for it, I don't think you could call any 5 of these albums boring. Unless you're like just...
No,
an
they're all
if you're like an absolute fucking idiot, you might call Godspeed boring. But that's like... That's only for like... If you like...
It's too long.
If you like music, even a double, probably you're not going to do that. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Well, I'm sure we'll do more of these top 5 albums.
And-
This was fun.
And we'll actually have a name for the series for the next one, so stay tuned for that.
Indeed.